Let's start going. Hey, howdy, everyone. Welcome. Okay, so, yet another humanities lecture. Why? Because. Just because. Oh, no, it's actually because you've enrolled for credit, and this is a class, and stuff like that. And they're paying me and whatnot. Anyway, today's lecture is brought to you by Dr. Womber. Dr. Womber, the stuffed plague doctor. He's happy to see you. Dr. Womber will be helping me out because we're going to talk about the Black Death, which sounds like a hardcore metal band. Now I have to get my hair out of my face. Anyway, the Black Death, or the bubonic plague, in its more proper name. And I'm sure you've heard of it. It's kind of hard to avoid having heard of it, but hopefully this lecture will kind of clear up some misconceptions or fill in gaps of information, in your information and so on and so forth. Okay. So, what was the Black Death? Where did it come from? Why is it such a big deal, etc.? Things that may seem relevant to us in a time of pandemic. Because the Black Death was a pandemic, and a hell of a pandemic it was. It is a type of plague, which is a sort of disease. It is specifically the bubonic plague, and it's still around today. It still exists. There just aren't that many cases of it. It's indigenous to Central Asia, and the population there, although it does kill people, the population there was used to fairly regular outbreaks and was much more resistant to it. But what made it such a big deal in Europe, well, let's back up a little bit. How does an Asian plague, the bubonic plague, get to Europe in the first place? And part of the answer is what we've been talking about for several videos now, which is the unraveling of the feudal order. The key element of feudalism is the localism of the political, social, economic structures. In the High Middle Ages, that began to change. The church began to assert itself as a quasi-public institution that was outside the normal feudal order, and yet also served to legitimize it. So that was weird. Because of the increase in trade and artisanship, more wealth was available in Europe, and a good bit of that wealth was used to capitalize on the increased opportunities for travel and to trade with the Far East. Now, I'm not saying that some dude from France rode all the way to China. These things take place in legs or steps. The wood, leather, and wool of Central and Northern Europe was traded across the Alps to Florence and other North Italian cities, where it was traded to the east, to Constantinople. That came up in the Rome unit, remember? Constantinople, the old Eastern Empire of the Roman Empire capital. It was traded to Constantinople in exchange for the spices and silks and other such things from the Far East, from India and Asia and whatnot. India and China and whatnot. So, trade flowed along a route called the Silk Road, because silk was one of the big things they traded on. From China, across India, the Persian Plateau, the Fertile Crescent, up into the Anatolian Peninsula, across the Black Sea, well, and then either across the Black Sea and then sort to Eastern Europe, or across the Mediterranean to North Italy, and then sort of across the Alps into Central and Northern Europe. Okay. So, none of this kind of trade would have taken place in the Dark Ages. First of all, the strict agricultural economy would not have afforded the amount of excess wealth necessary to make such trade viable. Second, the freedom of movement and travel would not have been possible in the chaotic conditions of continual warfare under pure feudalism. And last but not least, the lack of any kind of consistent rule of law would have severely hampered trade. So, lack of public institutions, lack of centralized power, all the kinds of things you don't see in feudalism, right? Public institutions, centralized power, very necessary for flourishing trade. All right. So, because the feudal order was already starting to unravel, Europe was able to engage in this kind of trade with the Far East. So that's crucial. The Black Plague was able to make its way all the way to Europe, in part because the feudal order was already unraveling. Because Europe was becoming a more global power. It was emerging out of the chaos of the Dark Ages, becoming more stable, becoming more centralized, widening the scope of its trade. And as a result, it opened up this avenue for the Black Plague to arrive. So that's one irony of the whole situation. Anyway, the plague is carried by fleas that lived on rats, and the fleas would also travel from rats to other animals, and specifically to humans, because, hey, even modern, very, humans who bathe a whole lot can still get fleas if you're around a lot of friggin' wild animals. And then you have to go bathe them off of you, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's a blood-borne disease. Okay, so what happens is some rats that are carrying fleas that are infected or carrying the Black Plague wind up on some caravans. There was a new outbreak in Central Asia. Lots of people died. Like I said, fewer than died in Europe because the population had evolved alongside this disease and was more resistant to it, but they're not totally immune. Right? People die. And people were dying along the caravan route because the plague was coming. But it would not reach its full potential of devastation until it hit a population that had no natural immunity to it whatsoever. So, it follows along the Silk Road, arrives in Constantinople, goes from Constantinople to northern Italy, where it first makes landfall in northern Europe in about 1346. Or 1347, one of the two. Anyway, the effects of the plague were nothing short of astonishing. Now, it's called the bubonic plague because it causes the swelling and discoloration of the lymph nodes here and in the groin under the arms. They would swell up and turn a dark color from the fluids trapped in them. Thus, there's the black part of it, and those swollen nodules are called buboes, B-U-B-O-E-S, buboes, singular bubo, B-U-B-O. It is therefore a plague that causes buboes, or a bubonic plague. All right. The plague was unbelievably contagious in this population that had no natural resistance to it whatsoever. Now, it wasn't airborne. It was bloodborne, and you couldn't get it from sneezing on somebody. But the medieval people did not understand the vector of transmission. The fleas were able to jump from animals to people, and then from one person to another person. I mean, if one person with fleas comes home and doesn't do something about it very quickly, the whole household has fleas, right? That means everybody's going to get infected. And people got infected at an alarming rate. Worse than that, they die at an alarming rate. Right now, as I film this, we're still in lockdown over a disease that has an overall death rate of just a couple of percent, which is, terrible. And it's terrible that so many people have died, over 200,000. That's not a good thing, right? And it has side effects on even people who don't die. And of course, that's an average death rate, right? If you're very old and you have certain conditions, your chance of dying if you get it are much, much higher. The thing about the bubonic plague was, if you got it, you still had about a 90% chance of dying. For all intents and purposes, if you got it, you were gonna die. And you were gonna die quick. In a most horrifying way. It started with fatigue, sweating, fever, rapidly moving on to the buboes that I described, and then the sudden and violent disgorging of blood from literally every orifice you've got until you die. Usually took less than a week, sometimes just a few days. Medieval doctors, without a theory of germs, without even really understanding that the friggin' fleas were causing it, were utterly stymied. They had no way to stop this. In Italy, where it first reached European shores, over the next 10 to 15 years, it would wipe out almost 75% of the population. In Germany and France, about 50%. About 20 to 30% of the population of England because of the cold, less than 20% in places like Norway and Sweden. But my God, think of that. For most of Europe, literally half of all the people that were alive died of this. Young, old, rich, poor. It didn't much matter, although we'll talk about that in a minute. Half. Think about literally everyone you know, everyone. The people you see at the QT on a regular basis when you stop for gas, your teachers, family, friends, everybody you know. And mentally in your head, flip a coin for each one. Thanos, right? Half. Right? They did a good job, thank you. Yeah, Thanos. Took me a minute to figure out what she was snapping about. I thought she was talking to cats at first. But no. Thanos. Snap. Half. We saw how that went. They had to build a time travel rig. The medieval people couldn't do that. They didn't have Captain America. The United States of America didn't exist. How could they have Captain America? I'm getting a little off track. The point is, it was terrible. And it was horrifying. People didn't just go quietly in their sleep. They died in a truly awful way. The medieval people were, needless to say, freaked the holy shit out. This wigged them out thoroughly. They were desperate to figure out what was going on and to try to stop it. The church, obviously, which had just sort of attained supremacy in the last few centuries, by flexing its power, not only as a temporal institution, but ultimately as a spiritual one, its claim to having a direct line to God, well, obviously all the prayers in the world weren't going to stop this, right? And people were not enthused. They turned a very hard eye upon the church, which had so recently, just in the past few hundred years, come to exert such influence over society. If the church wasn't going to be there and be able to put a stop to cataclysms like this, then why were they putting so much, why were they putting so much stock in it? All sorts of religious zealots arose and little traditions or cults of flagellants became common. If you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's an amusing scene where these monks are moving through the city in a single file line, Pie Jesu Domine, Domine Requiem, whack, and whack themselves in the head with a board. It's very funny. But it's based on a real medieval phenomena that came about during the Black Plague about 1,000 years after the movie is set. People inflamed with religious zeal and believing that this plague was a punishment from God would walk through the streets scourging themselves with whips and other implements that would rip open their flesh on their back, tear their cloth, blood would flow down their backs and their legs. And they would do this in full view of everyone as an act of penance, begging God for forgiveness and to lift this plague from them. They felt only an extreme act of contrition, the humiliation of the flesh, would be enough to satisfy whatever horrible sins they must have committed. Obviously, this too failed to stop the plague. Plague doctors. Bum, bum, bum. Plague doctors became a common sight. Dressed in long robes, wearing gloves, carrying a stick rather than a lantern, and wearing a mask that has, the sort of bird-like appearance to it. Basically, their job wasn't to cure the plague. Nothing could be done about that. Their main job was to check to see if someone had the plague or was just sick in some other fashion. Because at this point in history, the last thing you wanted to do was start coughing or looking ill in some way that wasn't the bubonic plague, because people might go ahead and chuck you on a burning pyre with the other plague victims in the hopes of getting rid of your illness before it infected anyone else. So the plague doctor was there to, check on people, see if they really had the plague or if they didn't. They certainly couldn't cure it. This did not stop them from formulating theories about it. Unfortunately, their medical theories were inadequate, based on a flawed understanding of the world. Now, if you've looked into medieval history at all or anything like that, you'll know that one of the things that people used to believe in the medieval and the ancient world was that everything was made of some combination of the 4 elements. If you've watched Avatar or played Pokemon, you know what the 4 elements are. They're air, earth, water, and fire. The idea was, as put forth by Aristotle originally, the idea was that everything was some combination of these elements. And it's less batshit than it sounds. Like, for instance, if anything was heavy or solid, that was the element of earth expressing itself. And if it was light and tended to float upwards, that was the element of air. Wood to his mind, had some element of water, some element of earth, and some element of air. And in particular, earth and air. And you're like, why the hell would that be? Think about it. If you apply fire to wood, it separates into components. There is the ash, the heavy part, the solid part that falls away, and the smoke. Now we know that that's not literally earth and air, but for people who believed in this, it made a certain degree of sense. The evidence of their senses matched their theory of how the world works. You apply fire to wood, and it separates into its constituent elements. The smoke, which is, say, the air, rises up, as air should. The earth falls down and remains as earth should. Again, weird, but it matched their perceptions of reality. So they believed it. Okay. So, medical theory in the medieval era was not very good at curing. Medical practice was not great at curing diseases. It was mostly focused on preventative medicine. And again, based on this theory of the 4 elements. In particular, it was based on the theory that all humans had 4 different fluids in them, or humors, as they were called. 4 humors, each one of them corresponding to one of the elements. And I guess kind of like a car, you had to have your fluids at the right level to be healthy. If the fluids, the humors, were out of balance, you would become unhealthy. Medieval medicine was therefore aimed at trying to keep all of your humors in balance, because once they got out of balance, there wasn't a lot they could do to fix you. And of course, we understand that that's because there's no such thing as humors. And, I mean, the fluids that they identify do exist, but health has nothing to do with those fluids being balanced. They aren't key to the 4 elements. And, you know, we get sick because of viruses, bacteria, and stuff like that. The evil doctors didn't know that. So once you got sick, they had real problems. So they tried to keep you healthy. How do they do that? Well, if everything in the world is tied in some way along the 4 elements, then they wanted you to balance sort of your inputs. Like, for instance, red meat was believed to be tied to fire, and thus the sanguine humor, right? You should get some red meat, but not too much. Anyway, things like that. You should rest, but not too often. You know, if you spend too much time sleeping, you will get the humor of melancholy, the black bile. Melancholy will become too prevalent in your blood. And that condition was called melancholy. Now, you and I know that word as being sort of a synonym, a fancy word for sadness, or, let's say, depression. In other words, they believe that if you spend too much time sleeping, too much time in the dark, too much time avoiding people, these are all things associated with melancholy. Your melancholy, your black bile, would become too prevalent, and you would become melancholic. You would gain the condition of melancholy. You'd be depressed. They had the right association. They just had it the wrong way around. They thought staying in your room and sleeping too much caused the depression, not was a symptom of it. It's remarkable how such a silly theory got so very close to a lot of things. Phlegm. We know phlegm. Phlegm. Phlegm was associated with water. If you got too much water, if you got too wet and cold, you would wind up having more phlegm. Think about that. You go out in the rain, in the cold, you don't dry off sufficiently, you don't get warm enough quick enough, and suddenly you're producing too much phlegm. You've got a cold. They had the association right. They knew that somehow being out in the wet and the cold was causing you to produce phlegm. They just didn't understand that being out in the wet and the cold was reducing your body's ability to fight the cold that you always have in you, the cold virus that everyone carries all the time. And it became active and started to cause you to produce excess blood. They were so close. It's remarkable, right? Anyway. What did they think? Oh, and by the way, sorry, this is where the whole idea of leeches come in. Why would you ever put leeches on someone to draw off their blood? Well, under this theory, you can have too much blood in your system, which is batshit. But their whole theory was based on excess humors. Humors out of balance. For some things, they thought maybe the problem was your sanguine, your blood humor was out of balance. You had too much of it. So anyway, how does this all get back to the plague? Well, now that we've explained that, it's a little easier to see. Blood is one of the humors. Right before you die, you start expelling all kinds of blood. So what did they think was happening? They thought you had too much of it. Your body wouldn't be shooting out blood everywhere if it was shy of the stuff. It's trying to get rid of the excess. So yes, they did try to cure it with leeches, right? How did they think you got it? There were lots of different theories, but one of them was the idea of bad air, right? Air is one of the elements. It can influence your humors. The idea was that bad air, or put another way, bad smells, could cause an imbalance in the humors, and you'd wind up with too much blood. Your body would try to get rid of the blood, and you would die. There you go. It all tracks as far as they're concerned. Why were you swelling up in places? It's the excess blood collecting, right? And they're not completely wrong there. The dark color is, stagnant blood there, and pus and stuff like that. But the bad smells, though, the idea that bad air, aka bad smells, are responsible for the plague, explain why Dr. Womber, our plague doctor, wears that silly mask. This part of that leather mask was stuffed with, I guess, basically potpourri, dried flower petals and things like that, to create a good smell. It's like a primitive gas mask that was filtering out all the bad smells. And there would be plenty of bad smells, right? Unwashed people, dung in the streets, so on and so forth. But oddly enough, plague doctors were able to help a little bit, even though their theory was wildly wrong. Because they had the theory that bad smells were a major reason why this happened, they advised people to keep clean, to keep their surroundings clean, to stay away from places like garbage dumps or smelly, unwashed animals. Well, rats are going to hang around garbage dumps, rats that carry fleas. Smelly, unwashed animals are going to have fleas. And if I bathe frequently, wash all my clothes frequently, keep my surroundings clean, there aren't going to be as many fleas, are there? Right? So, the plague doctors, despite being utterly and completely wrong about how this disease was happening, never suspecting fleas in the first place, managed to improve the survival rate at least a little bit. Utterly bizarre. It's funny how even when humans are wildly wrong about something, they can still sometimes stumble ass backwards into something kind of like a right answer. Anyway, it was only kind of like a right answer, though, because, as I said, it did kill off about half of the European population at the time in just a very short number of years. And then the plague subsided for a while, but it would come back almost every generation, every 30 years or so, up into the 17 or 1800s, when people understood it better and had a better chance of, knowing how to prevent it and just, stop it from spreading. The plague became a terrible fact of life, but it was that initial wave of the plague that was so completely devastating. What most people have thought was happening. I mean, we don't have to speculate. We have some writing from the time and a lot of art. People thought the friggin' world was ending, and I don't blame them. Half of everybody, but not evenly distributed, mind you. Entire villages could be wiped out. Whole families gone. Maybe leaving maybe everybody but one person, right? Powerful people, poor people. It seemed like no one was spared. The art of the period is truly macabre. Death was on everyone's mind all the time. So, what were the effects of the plague other than, a lot of dead people? Because if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that there are always social effects to these things. A disease is not simply a malediction of the body. It's experienced by us as social creatures. And a disease that spreads through society is experienced by us collectively as a society. So what were the social effects of the Black Plague? Well, the Black Plague only traveled to Europe because the feudal order was already beginning to unravel. Wealth, not dependent on agriculture, was being produced in a great enough scale, and there was enough stability in the institutions and in the rule of law for that wealth to be effectively exported to the East in exchange for goods. But the Black Plague helped accelerate the downfall of medieval society, of feudalism. And it did so in a very odd way. The pandemic that we're suffering under has been bad for business. But in a strange way, the Black Plague was good for business, at least for some people. For many years, the nobility had been suffering under declining revenues and a declining share of the overall wealth. Nobles thought of themselves as warriors and landowners. They were not warriors much anymore, some of them still, but not nearly as much as they had been. But they still firmly believed that their wealth came from land. Nobles did not do trade. That was for peasants, as they thought about it. The real peasants worked the fields. The merchants and artisans who were making money on trade and trade goods were getting vastly wealthy. I talked earlier about how there's a linear connection between the amount of land and the amount of wealth that agriculture can produce. Without a change in technology, that linear correlation does not vary, all other things being equal. But trade is different from that. Trade can almost, at least in comparison with agriculture, it seems like trade can sort of generate money out of thin air. So the share that the nobles had in the European economy had been falling steadily for centuries. But it also been falling in a different kind of way. And that way was this. As the overall economy grew, the obligations that they had placed on their peasants were yielding less relative amounts of wealth. Because it's not like they had an IRS They didn't have assessors to go around. They weren't sophisticated enough for that. If you were a peasant who farmed land for your lord, you owed him a certain number of bushels per year. And if you could somehow manage to get more bushels out, that's good for you, right? The theory was peasants would work hard, right? If they could get more bushels, it's more for themselves. You just have to give the lord his cut off the top. But as society grew wealthier and able to trade more effectively for food, the value of these individual bushels, the values of these individual units of agricultural product were falling. So nobles were in a sense being poorer for a variety of reasons. Peasants, on the other hand, stumbled into a bonanza when it came to this plague. After all, a bunch of people died. They left farms unattended or understaffed. The lord's entire income depends upon the agricultural product being brought in from these farms. So when enterprising peasants would go to the lord and say, hey, look, my family's still around, it'll bust our asses to do it, but we'll work both of these farms on the condition that those farms become ours. The lords are over a barrel. What could they possibly say? So the first thing that happened was that many peasants acquired suddenly vast farms, sometimes on very favorable terms. I don't want to make it sound like the Black Death was a good thing. It wasn't. There was a great deal of suffering and death. But up until this point, on the eve of the Black Death, if you will, there had been a serious overcrowding problem in Europe. There was not enough farmland to provide a living for the people that worked it. And many peasants who were turned off of their farms by their families because there were just too many mouths to feed on the meager amounts that they could draw from the land would go to cities and become beggars or go to the countryside and become bandits because, quite frankly, they had little other option. So a lot of peasants suddenly found themselves in a much better position in terms of land ownership. Quickly, it moved even beyond that. They stopped negotiating for better terms within the framework of the feudal contract and began stepping out of it altogether. The lords were willing parties to this, even as they decried the general trend. Imagine if you are a landowning lord and you have a lot of farms that need working and not enough peasants to work it. In the old days, you might have raided an enemy settlement and enslaved a bunch of their peasants. That kind of thing hasn't happened in centuries, thanks to the moderating influence of the church and the centralized powers of the monarchs. No. What you do now is offer a better deal. Remember how I said that those peasants were going to their lords and negotiating better deals for more land? Well, now they got other lords, not even their own feudal lord. And suddenly there is a labor market, right? It's not simply a bunch of peasants who are tied to the land in hereditary fashion working for the same lord. Now there's mobility. And some peasants picked up and moved to the next village, maybe even to a distant country, if they thought they could get a good deal. Ownership of the land, easier taxes, other privileges. Right? Suddenly there's a mobile labor market, able to negotiate and even, in a primitive sort of fashion, organize strikes. The peasant uprising of 1381 was one such strike. And it was precipitated by a truly ridiculous legal act taken by King of England, who tried to stop the clock, man, or rolled it back. Because people were starting to freak out over the fact that the peasants were suddenly wielding a great deal of negotiating power, right, being the prime movers in the economy now, everything grinds to a halt without them. They tried to put a stop to it. They said the king tried to make it illegal to offer wages or to charge for anything more than had been offered or charged prior to the plague, prior to 1347 or what have you, whatever the date was in England. It was a dead letter before even the ink dried. That was never going to work. First of all, the peasants went apeshit. But even when the revolt was put down, no lord was going to abide by it, because there was too much to be gained by not abiding by it. Right? All the lords are like, all right, we can't offer them any more than we did before the plague. And one guy's going to go, maybe you can't, but I can. And all the peasants are going to be working for me, baby. Right? A vast amount of wealth, both in terms of real estate and just plain money, was redistributed to the lowest of the classes, the peasant class, as a result of this. And many peasants were elevated almost into the same middle class as the merchants and artisans. But more importantly, I think, the mindset changed. Feudalism is based on individual contracts between a vassal and a lord. Into the High Middle Ages, vassalage had become hereditary and traditional, and the conditions of the promise or the exchange of oaths with the Lord had become fixed by ages and ages of expectations. The Black Plague first loosened the bonds of those expectations and then shattered them altogether when peasants began searching for better work, looking for new opportunities. In other words, acting like employees, acting like a labor force in a free market. It wasn't a completely free market, not yet. There were still medievalisms left about. The idea of a fair price, which is actually a theological concept. The idea that, they didn't have any concept of supply and demand, well, at least not until the plague came along. And they got a concept of supply and demand when it came to labor real fast. But prior to that, the idea that you might charge more for something just because it's scarce did not apply to everything. The church said that certain things like bread required for life had what was called a natural price or a fair price, which could not be higher than like the poorest worker's wages for a day. Enough bread to live on for a day could not cost more, morally speaking, than a person could make in a day, even at the meanest job, because otherwise the whole economy, as far as they were concerned, would be set up to let people starve, and that was unacceptable to them. Just didn't make any sense. So there were still medievalisms. It was not a completely free economy, but the concept of supply and demand as it applied to labor had definitely come to Europe as a result of the plague. And that is antithetical to feudalism. That's just not compatible with feudalism. So a plague that came to Europe because the feudal order was already unraveling then accelerated the unraveling of the feudal order. Between the plague And between the plague and the 100 Years' War, many historians believe that the 14th century, the 1300s, was perhaps the most calamitous century of the Middle Ages, and was definitely where things sort of began inevitably going off the rails as far as the old feudal order was concerned. There was no coming back after the events of the 14th century. Now, the plague, as I said, would keep recurring for hundreds of years, every now and again, in smaller and larger outbreaks. Something you always had to be afraid of, outbreaks of the plague, after that first initial pass that swept through all of Europe. And the 100 Years' War would not end until the mid-15th century, the mid-1400s, by which time other terrible and calamitous events had taken place. Most notably, the fall of Constantinople, which sent many Greek scholars, engineers, doctors, lawyers, people like that, fleeing to northern Italy, where they would suddenly find that their culture was in demand, if you will. And that is the beginning of the Italian Renaissance, which is, if anything, is a definitive end to the Middle Ages. Trappings of the Middle Ages, echoes of the old feudal order would remain. There's still a king and queen, well, a queen right now, in England, ruling in an unbroken line of tradition going all the way back to William of Normandy in 1066. Up until the 1700s, there would be a king in France, right? Germany kept trying to reunite the Holy Roman Empire as Charlemagne had done all the way up into the 1800s. Echoes of the medieval era would continue to last. The influence of the church on society, established in, or really established in the 11th century, would last for a long time. England still has an official religion, the Church of England. Just because the Middle Ages ended doesn't mean all the medieval stuff went away. But it does mean the fundamental character of society had changed. Feudalism, the key defining feature of the Middle Ages, meant the lack of a centralized power, the lack of a public sphere, and instead power that would have gone to a government being held by hundreds and hundreds of local authorities who hold their position not by dint of legitimacy, but by dint of force. And instead of a tradition of rule of law, there was just individual compacts, individual oaths of vassalage and loyalty. The idea of being a citizen, as in Rome, did not exist. You were a vassal, that is all. But by the 15th century, all of these things had come back in greater or lesser degree all over Europe. The French king and the English queen have bureaucracies of professional administrators to run their realms. Standardized rights are extended by the crown, regardless of the preferences of local lords. The church acts as a kind of quasi-public institution. Rule of law mostly prevails, even when it comes to kings and queens. Urban life regenerates. Trade is robust. Wealth is abundant. The core essential elements of the Middle Ages are no more in most of Europe by the mid-15th century, certainly by the end of the 15th century. So we're going to stop there. I'll talk a little bit about the beginning of the Renaissance next time. I want to thank Dr. Womber for his help. Thank you, Dr. Womber. You didn't put any leashes on me. It was very nice of you. No problem. You're still going to die. He's a pessimist. Actually, he's a realist. We're all going to die. Just maybe not tomorrow. I don't know. Depends on how much more of this frigging treadmill I do. All right. We'll dip our toes in the beginnings of the Renaissance in the next video. Don't tell the Humanities 2 teachers. They'll flog me. All right. Have a good one. Be well. Talk to you later.